There are moments that feel insignificant in the second they happen. But later, you realize they were the pivot point, the exact moment your trajectory shifted. This is a story about one of those nights. If you've ever felt like you were running a race you didn't sign up for, just to keep everyone else comfortable, then this might resonate with you. It's about the quiet kind of conversation that doesn't just echo in the room, but in your chest long after the lights go out. Hold on just a moment before we continue. If the story is touching something in you, please take a second to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely makes a difference and helps me bring you more stories like this one. I also want to hear from you. Write in the comments. Where are you right now? Are you tucked away in a peaceful village where stars fill the sky, or surrounded by the hum and glow of a city that never sleeps? I didn't know it then. Sitting on the edge of my bed in the dim yellow light, but I was about to have the very understanding I'd been starving for, delivered by the last person I expected. It was a Tuesday, forgettable and still. I was curled up on my duvet, my laptop humming but ignored. I turned my phone screen down, trying to resist the urge to numb my brain with endless scrolling. The room held the faint, dusty scent of old paper and the lingering aroma of the chamomile tea I'd brewed earlier. It felt safe in there, small and contained. When the knock came, it wasn't the sharp rap that signals trouble. It was gentle. 2 taps, followed by the familiar, timbered voice of my father. "Hey, Bear, you decent?" I rolled my eyes at the nickname. I was 22, a college graduate technically, yet Bear still stuck. "Yeah, Dad, come in." The door creaked open. He leaned against the frame, not entering right away. He looked worn out, not the heavy tiredness of anger, but the soft exhaustion of a long day. He was still in his button-down, sleeves undone at the wrists. We looked at each other for a beat. The silence felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't place. "Everything okay?" I asked, mostly out of reflex. He nodded, stepping inside and leaving the door ajar, a sliver of the hallway light cutting across the rug. He bypassed the bed and sat in the armchair by the window, maintaining a deliberate distance. "Just wanted to catch up," he said, "if you're not busy." That was the first sign. My father wasn't one for idle preamble. He was a fixer, direct, and utilitarian. I sat up straighter, a sudden thrum of nerves in my veins. "Sure, what's on your mind?" He inhaled slowly, looking at me with an intensity that made me feel like he was seeing past my skin. "I've been watching you lately," he started, "watching how fast you're moving." I shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Just keeping up, I guess." A small smile touched his mouth, but it didn't erase the concern in his eyes. "Maybe that's actually what I wanted to ask you about." The room felt smaller suddenly. I waited, clutching the edge of the blanket. His question came softly, which somehow made it more devastating. "Are you actually happy right now? I mean, deep down. Or are you just acting the part because you think it's what's required of you?" I wasn't ready for that. Not from him. People asked about my career, my rent, my dating life. No one asked about the engine underneath the hood. I let out a nervous chuckle. "Wow, putting the heavy questions on the table tonight, huh?" "I know," he said. "You don't have to answer immediately." But the truth was already clawing its way up my throat. I looked at my hands, picking at a hangnail I'd ignored for days. "I don't know," I whispered. Saying it aloud felt like dropping a heavy bag I'd been carrying for miles. Some days I feel like I'm nailing it. Other days I feel like a total fraud. Like I'm wearing a costume that doesn't fit. He didn't jump in to fix it. He just sat there, a solid presence, giving me the oxygen to keep speaking. It made the tightness in my ribs loosen just enough to breathe. "I think I'm terrified of choosing the wrong path," I admitted, my voice cracking. "Of wanting things that don't match the version of me that everyone likes." He leaned in, elbows on his knees. "What do you think those wrong things are?" I hesitated, then met his gaze. "Things that would surprise people? Things that aren't safe." The house settled around us, the fridge humming downstairs. He nodded, processing. "I understand that," he said. "More than you realize." That shocked me. My father had always seemed like a man who had drawn his map in permanent ink years ago. Hearing him say that made him seem less like a monument and more like a fellow traveler. "I came in here tonight to tell you something important," he said, his voice dropping lower. "You don't owe anyone a performance. Not me, not your mother, nobody." My throat burned. I hadn't realized how much permission I needed until he handed it to me. "You're not let down?" I asked, barely audible. He shook his head instantly. "No, I'm proud that you're brave enough to ask yourself the hard questions. That's the only way you build a life that's actually yours." When he stood up to leave, he paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "If you ever want to dissect this stuff again, I'm around. No judgment, just honesty." After he left, I sat in the semi-darkness, staring at the empty space he'd vacated. I felt different. Not fixed, but rearranged. It was the first time I realized that the right question doesn't push you away. It pulls you closer to who you actually are. I didn't sleep much that night. My brain was too busy replaying the conversation, turning his words over like stones in a river. The house felt different, too, like the walls had expanded. I lay on my back listening to the wind in the eaves, marveling at how a few sentences could dismantle your anxiety and build a foundation at the same time. Morning brought the usual routine. Sunlight bled through the curtains, illuminating the dust motes. I could hear the clatter of pans downstairs as my father started breakfast. Part of me wanted to burrow under the covers and hide from the vulnerability of the night before, but another part of me felt a magnetic pull toward him, like we were now accomplices in a secret. I dragged myself up, threw on an oversized cardigan, and padded downstairs. He looked up as I entered, his expression easy, open. No awkwardness, just warmth. "Morning," he said, pouring coffee. "Cup, please," I said. My voice sounded steadier than I felt. We sat at the round oak table, steam curling from our mugs. The ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than usual. I watched him butter his toast, noticing the gray at his temples and the way his shoulders dropped now that he was off the clock. "I've been thinking about what you said," I ventured, breaking the silence. He looked up, eyes calm. "Yeah?" "I don't think I've ever actually stopped to ask myself if I'm happy," I said. "I've just been clearing hurdles, trying to get to the next level." He nodded slowly. "That's a common trap. It's easy to mistake momentum for meaning. Meaning. It felt heavier, more significant than happiness. "How did you do it?" I asked. "When you were my age, how did you know what to chase?" He let out a breath, half sigh, half laugh. "I didn't. I made choices based on duty, on what looked good on paper. Some of them worked out. Some of them took me years to unpack." He sounded wistful, not regretful. It made me feel closer to him than I had in a decade. He wasn't lecturing me from above. He was walking beside me. After we ate, I needed air. I went for a long walk through the neighborhood, the autumn air biting at my cheeks. I thought about the mask I wore for the world: competent, agreeable, driven. And then I thought about the quieter version of myself underneath, the one who was afraid she wanted something different. That afternoon, my dad popped his head into the living room. "I'm heading to the garden center to grab some mulch. Want to ride along?" Usually, I would have passed to catch up on emails, but something made me grab my shoes. We drove in a comfortable silence, the sun warming the dashboard through the windshield. It felt ordinary, but I knew it wasn't. Walking through the rows of shrubs and bags of soil, he asked about my writing, my friends, my vague plans for the future. Not with an agenda, just with genuine interest. I found myself answering without filtering. When I didn't know an answer, I said, "I haven't figured that out yet," and I didn't apologize for it. We stopped in front of a display of saplings. "Hard to believe these little sticks turn into giant oaks," he mused. "Yeah," I said. "It's a long process. Scary sometimes," he added, thinking about how much time it takes. "Scary doesn't mean wrong, though," I found myself saying. He smiled, proud. Exactly. On the drive back, that sentiment settled in my bones. That night I opened my laptop again. But instead of browsing, I opened a blank document. I started writing stream of consciousness, fears, desires, things I'd never admitted to myself. It felt terrifying and liberating, like opening a window in a stuffy room. I realized then that the gift of that conversation wasn't the advice, it was the permission to be curious, to see my uncertainty not as a flaw but as the starting line. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The days that followed settled into a new rhythm. The urgency of that first night faded, replaced by a steady, low-level awareness. I still went to work, still replied to texts, still laughed at jokes, but the filter had changed. It felt like I'd cleaned a lens I hadn't known was smudged. A few evenings later, I found my dad in the den, sorting through a stack of vintage vinyl records. He pulled an old player from the closet and was dusting it off. I hovered in the doorway, but he waved me over. "Look at this," he said, handing me a sleeve. It was a record from the year he graduated college. I held the cardboard sleeve, studying the grainy photo of a band I didn't know. "This is ancient." "I was at this concert," he said, pointing to the tiny venue name on the back. "Right before I started my first real job." "You went to concerts?" I teased. "I thought you were born in a suit." He laughed, a genuine bark of laughter. I had hair down to my shoulders, actually, and I had absolutely no idea what I was doing with my life. I sat on the floor beside him. "I always pictured you just knowing. Like you woke up one day and decided to be a responsible adult." "That's the trick parents play," he said, placing a record on the turntable. "We edit the footage to make it look like a straight line. But it's messy. It's all messy." The crackle of static filled the room before the music started, a mellow, bluesy guitar riff. We sat there for a long time listening, watching the dust motes dance in the light. I realized how much energy I'd spent worrying about the alternate versions of my life, the paths I hadn't taken. I was missing the song that was actually playing. Later that night, I wrote in my journal again. I wrote about fear, about how exhausting it is to carry expectations that aren't yours. I wrote about seeing my father not as a pillar of authority, but as a man who once sat on a floor just like this, wondering if he was making the right moves. The following weekend, we took a drive up the coast, no destination in mind. The ocean was a steel gray under the overcast sky. We talked about everything and nothing. At one point, looking out at the water, I voiced a thought that had been nagging me. I'm afraid that if I really go after what I want, this creative stuff, the uncertainty, that people will think I'm wasting my potential. He kept his eyes on the road. Disappointment is a part of life, kid. People are going to be disappointed. But here's the thing. You can't let their fear dictate your courage. Sometimes disappointing people is just the price of admission for being honest. I looked at the passing trees, feeling a lump in my throat. It wasn't sadness, it was relief. The truth is heavy, but it's solid. You can build on it. When we got home, I felt drained, but in a good way. Like a muscle that had been worked and was now stronger. Lying in bed that night, I realized I hadn't been fearless all week. I didn't have a 10-year plan, but I had something better. I had the authorization to question, to pause, to not know. By the end of the week, I noticed the change wasn't just internal. In a meeting at work, when my boss asked about my long-term goals, I didn't spit out the corporate buzzwords I'd rehearsed. I said, I'm still exploring where my strengths best fit, but I'm really interested in the creative side of the project. And instead of feeling small, I felt grounded. I was standing on my own truth. That evening, my dad found me in the kitchen, rinsing dishes. The house was quiet, the day winding down. You seem different lately, he noted, leaning against the counter. Lighter. I dried my hands on a towel and smiled. I feel lighter. Not because I have it all figured out, but because I've stopped trying to force the pieces to fit where they don't belong. He nodded, a look of deep satisfaction on his face. That's how it begins. Thanks for asking me that night, I said softly, even though it freaked me out. He grinned, the familiar crinkles around his eyes deepening. The best questions usually do. I went to bed early that night. I sat on the edge of my mattress reflecting on the girl I was 7 days ago, checking boxes, performing competence, terrified of the pause. I didn't judge her. She was doing the best she could with the tools she had. I opened my notebook one last time and wrote a few lines about what actually matters to me. Not status. not approval, but connection, honesty, growth that happens at its own pace. It felt like drawing a map without worrying about the destination yet. As I turned off the lamp and the room submerged into darkness, I felt a profound sense of peace. It wasn't an ending, but a beginning. I knew later, looking back, that everything after this moment would trace its lineage to that quiet knock, that unexpected question, and the space my father created for me to become myself. I learned that personal growth doesn't always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives through a gentle knock on a bedroom door, from someone who loves you enough to ask the hard thing, and patient enough to sit in the dark with you while you find the answer. And that, more than anything, is what stayed with me.